Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It means so much to have all of you here. So the fact that we're here today on such short notice is just proof and a testament to how important this is to all of us. So first off, it's just an honor to be on a panel with so many of my amazing peers and colleagues who I honestly look up to. So I'd just like to share my appreciation for being able to learn and grow from such good people. So just to briefly introduce our panelists, we have the amazing Dr. Onye Nnorom, Dr. Suzanne Shoush, Ms. Donna Alexander, Dr. Suzanne Stewart, and Mr. Maurice Michelin. So the Q&A is going to be open the whole time, and you can ask questions as we go at any point. Our moderators will be watching, so please feel free to ask questions. We're going to have 1 hour for the panel where we do 10 minutes per speaker, and then 30 minutes for Q&A right after. So again, thank you all for being here for this important conversation, because at this point, it is clear that policing is a public health crisis and things need to change in the city. So to start, my name is Semir Bulle and I'm a third-year medical student at the University of Toronto. But to really get to know why I'm on this panel, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. My parents came to Canada as refugees to the Sherbourne downtown area in Toronto, and I was born right here at St. Mike's. We lived in a crowded one-bedroom community housing apartment with several extended family members for a couple of years until we were able to pool our resources together and get a home in the Dixon-Rexdale area. Growing up in the Dixon-Rexdale area, my community was a diverse one, mainly filled with East African and Caribbean immigrants. I had a wonderful and loving childhood where even though we never had much, we were always able to get by. But as I got older, I began to notice things. When I was 16, I began to being able to drive, and I would start getting pulled over, and the officers started giving me a variation of the same excuse. We were just checking who I was or what I was doing. And by the end of my first year driving, I was carded over a dozen times when I never committed a single offense. There was even times when I was driving one way down the street, the cop would be driving the other way, and he'd pull around just to get me, just to check on you. And it would always be the exact same excuse. This was at the same time that Bill Blair, who's currently the public health safety minister for Trudeau, was a police chief in Toronto. And to this day, when he's even questioned in the House of Commons to apologize for his role in enforcing the systemic racist practice of street checks and carding, he simply deflects and mentions how much diversity the police force has. I noticed early how the police would use violence or the threat of it to intimidate the kids in my community. My friends, my cousins, my brother have all been directly abused by the police coming into our communities with carte blanche to commit violence against us. The problem is the qualified immunity. The fact that these police officers do not come for our communities and they carry themselves like a foreign occupying force. The police officers are taught that they are a thin blue line between civil society and anarchy. But in reality, they look at us as criminals and thugs who are guilty until proven innocent. And this is how we have cases like DeAndre Campbell, where he called 911 on himself during a mental health crisis, and it ended up being shot by the police. Where till this day, the offending officer that shot him is refusing to give a statement or even be investigated. This is the same story we hear with the SIU over and over again, where we have an independent review board that is filled with former police officers, which is why the same thing has happened or is happening over and over again with Caleb Tabila Njoko, Sami Yatim, who was shot 9 times due to transit fare issue, and the other day, Ijaz Chaudhry, whose family asked for them to enter to de-escalate, but you know what happened? And so many more. So when people ask for police reform and say that we should be waiting for the full report of the SIU before jumping to conclusions, know that the SIU was created over 30 years ago in 1990. These problems have been going on in our community and we've been screaming about them into the void for decades. We cannot police ourselves out of systemic poverty and systemic racism. The fact that every school I went to growing up had a police officer, but never a nurse or psychologist. In fact, TDSB, York Region, and most recently the PDSB have all been under review for human rights abuses as a result of systemic anti-Black racism. PDSB so much so that the provincial government has just had to step in and remove the director themselves. So the problem here is, unless you're from a low-income, racialized community, you're often left in the dark about what is truly happening with policing in these neighborhoods. Policing is a public health crisis. By now, we are aware that one of the origins of policing was to protect private property, including slaves, which is why a couple of months ago, a 16-year-old Indigenous minor was killed for stealing alcohol, but no one talks about it now. If any other system in society worked as inefficiently and as reckless as the police, they would be completely dismantled and reset. What if there were a few bad apples as pilots, or as surgeons, or as doctors? Would we be all right with them in our society? Obviously not. So the question here is, why are the police allowed to function with such immunity? As doctors, all of our actions are under the scrutiny of a cost-benefit analysis, down to which tests to order and when to do them. We need to rationalize every action we do because of the healthcare budget. Yet where's the transparency from the TPS budget? As doctors for defunding the police, we are demanding the following. Number one, full transparency of the Toronto Police Service budget with disclosure on how and why police budget allocations have been prioritized over mental health, housing, education, recreational, and healthcare resources. An immediate change to the use of force laws to forbid lethal force, bodily harm, and disarming of police forces during interactions with civilians. Number three, defunding of the police budget with a reallocation towards the creation of new community emergency services to support the mental health needs of Black, Indigenous, racialized, disabled, poor, and other community members made vulnerable by structural violence, and the creation of a non-police response team trained in de-escalation and crisis support, who root their work in transformative trauma and community-informed practices. To us, it is clear that police, despite increasing yearly budgets, have not made significant impacts in the reduction of crime. And after multiple decades of failed attempts at police reform, tangible solutions need to center around the voices of the people within these communities. Thank you. So moving on to our next panelist, we're going to go into Dr. Nnorom.
Thank you, Semir. So my name is Dr. Nnorom. I am a family doctor and public health specialist and the president of the Black Physicians Association of Ontario. I'd like to first start with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the land that we are meeting on virtually, but nonetheless in Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And as someone of African descent, our history on this land is very complex, but largely has been one that has been quite painful. And so I am, here in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and minoritized communities, calling for the defunding of the police and reallocation of resources to community-led programs. The use of excessive force by law enforcement, particularly for people who have experienced mental health crises, has had a profoundly negative impact on Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized communities. My area of medicine focuses on population health. So what makes some communities sicker or healthier than others? I'm going to speak about the intersection of systemic racism, law enforcement, and how it impacts the health of racialized communities at the systems level, the community level, and the provider level. But I do feel it's important to situate myself first. As the child of working class African and Caribbean immigrants to this country, I spent much of my childhood and youth in lower income neighborhoods. Members of my family who are Black males have been stopped repeatedly by the police for no legitimate reason, as was stated previously by medical student Semir Bulle. Furthermore, I also have a family member who feared for his life when he was stopped because he fit the description of a suspect. On the other hand, I also know what it is to grow up in an environment where there is urban gun violence, and I know what it is to duck and run at the sound of gunshots. I fully appreciate that this is a complex issue and a great deal of thought needs to go into it. We need to think about solutions, but really today I want to talk about some of the root problems. At the systems level, we need to understand that the problems we are discussing today are rooted in systemic and structural racism. This is not about what one police officer did or did not do. Our social systems were established a very long time ago. Colonization and slavery required categorizing people by race. This is deeply embedded in our society and continues to function to devalue and disempower racialized people. This structure that we all live in differentially allocates societal resources and opportunities based on race. My work focuses on anti-Black racism, so I'm going to zoom in on that for a moment. Anti-Black racism refers to the policies and practices that reinforce stereotyping and discrimination against people of African descent. It is rooted in our unique history and experience of enslavement in Canada and across the Americas. The stereotypes derived during that time, particularly regarding our intelligence, civility, pain tolerance, and the need to be surveilled, are still with us today. The United Nations has expressed concern about the human rights situation of Black Canadians. This is a public health issue, as was stated before, because the stress of everyday racism takes a toll on communities. The Canadian Public Health Association has stated that anti-Black racism is a contributing factor to poverty and unemployment in Black communities, racial profiling, higher incarceration rates, and law enforcement violence. For communities, we know that the threat of violence exacerbates distress. Black Torontonians are 20 times more likely to be shot by police than white residents, according to the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Our youth also experience violence in their interactions with police. I'd like to share a quote from the research of Dr. Akwasi Owusu-Bempah, researcher at the University of Toronto. In his study entitled Black Males' Perceptions and Experiences with the Police in Toronto, he quotes a 16-year-old Black boy who said, "They arrested me for no reason and I wasn't talking. They saw that I had a crack in my head. I had it stitched from basketball. They banged my head against the wall and cracked it open again to make me talk. It started bleeding again. I had to get it restitched because one of my stitches came out. I was just turned 14. As my colleagues have noted, we cannot police our way out of systemic racism and systemic poverty. The murder of George Floyd has captured the world's attention, but way before that, police violence has been traumatizing Black, Indigenous, and minoritized communities in Canada. It is particularly painful when the victims of police violence are in need of mental health crisis support. In Canada, this has included people like Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Ian Price, Andrew Loku, and most recently, Ejaz Chowdhury, amongst many others. These deadly tragedies highlight concerns around police response to people in distress. When people are in crisis, we know that what they need is care, not confrontation with an armed officer. The impacts of these tragedies, even when they do not result in death, have profound ripple effects on witnesses, families, and racialized communities in the form of vicarious traumatization, which is essentially secondhand trauma. As I mentioned earlier, these are communities that are facing multiple intersecting forms of injustice that negatively impact their health, freedom, and well-being. Witnessing or hearing about ethno-racial trauma can lead to worsening stress, mental health and physical health issues, cultural trauma, and intergenerational trauma. Ultimately, it erodes trust for law enforcement and our entire system. On top of that, due to the marginalized status of victims and their communities, it is extremely challenging to access culturally appropriate mental health resources, leading to unresolved or worsening traumatization. As providers who serve these communities, we are left picking up the pieces. When we have a patient who is suicidal or in crisis and we call 911 for help and excessive force is used, the consequences are profound. There is broken trust between patients, providers, and the community. We as providers are also left with limited solutions for our patients. After hearing of these types of events, when we have a patient in crisis, there's a tedious mental calculation that has to be made. Providers in our community often end up asking themselves, will the police come and harm my patient? Or will this patient who is in crisis harm themselves or others? In summary, aggressive policing is a threat to the physical and mental health of Black, Indigenous, and many other marginalized communities. It is a public health issue. It is rooted in systemic racism, colonization, and other forms of systemic exclusion. It also sends a message to everyone in those marginalized communities, which is essentially, you are not safe, I am not safe, we are on our own. As a physician, all I can say is the present system does not work, and it puts patients, families, and communities at risk. We need to divest of this system and invest in our communities. Thank you.
So thank you very much for hosting this panel. Thank you very much for having me. I really want to introduce myself as a woman who is Indigenous, Black, and a mother. Like Semir, my 3 sons were also born downtown at St. Mike's Hospital in Toronto. I'm also a doctor and an intergenerational residential school survivor, okay? That said, I want to start with reconciliation, which is something we talk about a lot in Canada, right? So when we're talking about reconciliation, whether we think it's alive, dead, or a myth, we are all acknowledging that a deep wrong has been done. And this wrong is wrong in the form of structural violence. And the only solution to structural violence is structural justice, okay? Canada has been built on an explicit relationship of non-consent between Indigenous and Black communities. Indigenous and Black people did not write the laws that police enforce, nor were they given an opportunity to define themselves in society before the racial bias defined them. We cannot reform our way out of systemic violence. We must defund and rebuild. A relationship of non-consent is by definition a relationship of violence. And it is important to make it clear that we're talking about structures and not individuals. We've seen this violence reflected in very high profile police-involved deaths of 9 Indigenous, Black, and people of color since April alone. And in addition, we see a never-ending stream of harm against BIPOC communities in our news and our social media streams. We've spent centuries marginalizing and structurally disempowering Indigenous and Black communities. We have then fabricated a myth of scarcity in which our leaders, pretend to be helpless, in which they tell us that there's not enough resources to address the crises in affordable housing, homelessness, overdoses, education, recreation, childcare, climate change, mental health, or physical well-being. Saying that we do not have the resources to address these crises is simply not true. We know police enforcement is inferior to community support when it comes to curbing violence and creating safety. Yet year after year, we are not seeing a solutions-based budget. And this is something that our city council very literally has direct control over. Reforming indicates that the systems of violence that result in police killings are rooted in nothing but problematic protocols. But we're looking at the wrong moment. We're looking at the moment when the trigger is pulled and not the generations of systemic exclusion, systemic violence, economic exclusion, and chronic defunding of Indigenous and Black communities. It is not about litigating the rightness or the wrongness of a police killing. This is a structure that has taken centuries to build. This is about litigating the rightness or wrongness of the conditions that led to police intervention in the first place. We should be able to intervene before 911 call is made. This goes beyond the need for the community to survive. This is about our community's need to thrive. Reform cannot change the fact that money is in the wrong resource. Listen, the system is not broken. It was literally built this way. Reform is ridiculous. There's no reforms that have worked, and reform is missing the point. The point is that the relationship was created in violence and a desire to control, and therefore it must be deconstructed, defunded, and reimagined in a consensual manner with Indigenous and Black people's voices. Reform involves solutions which address the wrong problem. I deal with trauma, mental health, crises, domestic violence, homelessness regularly. And when I'm managing a patient in overt distress, it's just like what Dr. Nnorom just said. I literally have to stop and make a mental calculation about which outcome is more likely to result in my patient's death. Is it the scenario in which I call 911 for help, or the scenario in which I do not? And then I also have to understand that after years of experiencing exclusion in healthcare as a result of healthcare stereotype threat and exclusion of Indigenous and Black people represented in healthcare as doctors, nurses, physicians, social workers, every aspect, when they finally have a doctor that is from their community, who they relate to, who understands them in a trauma-informed lens, I have to risk throwing that entire relationship away and losing my therapeutic bond with that patient the second that I'd called 911. As of 2018, a minimum of all people killed by police in Canada struggled with mental illness, substance abuse, or both. And of course, these deaths are disproportionately Indigenous and Black. The Toronto Police Services are second only to the RCMP in police-involved fatalities of civilians. The rate at which Canadians are killed by police has doubled in the past 2 decades. And why? It is because we continue to push the police towards an unattainable mandate. It is not fair, it is not safe, and it is certainly not efficient. Police are police. They themselves know that they cannot police their way out of structural racism and structural violence. They are not social workers, crisis counselors, nurses, peer workers, teachers, principals, construction site managers. They are police. And yet their budget is more than $1 billion. Was that decision evidence-based? Was expanding the budget and their mandate year after year at the expense of resourcing and rebuilding communities evidence-based? Because I cannot imagine that it was. The safest communities are not the communities with the most police. They are the communities that are the most empowered, the most well-resourced, and the communities that have political influence. You, as city council members, as our mayor, as our leaders, you have an opportunity and a responsibility to act. You have an opportunity and a responsibility to be transparent. We want to know how and why you have chosen to prioritize policing budgets over other needed resources. We want to know how and why you feel this budget reflects the needs of our city. Given the entrenched and systemic racism and the foundation of non-consent in which our society and our policing was designed, we cannot reform our way out of this. We must defund, rebuild, redesign, and reconcile. And listen, you have the power and the opportunity to do this. This is the biggest civil rights movement in known human history. You can decide to rein in the astronomical police budget, and you could put $500 million into our communities in ways that are meaningful and effective. You can start to listen to Indigenous and Black voices before they are screaming, "I can't breathe." Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the 3 panelists before me. I, like everyone else, have been listening very intently to what you've been saying. My name is Suzanne Stewart. I'm a clinical psychologist and a researcher in Indigenous health at the University of Toronto. I've been working in Toronto for 13 years doing this work, and I've been working exclusively on the front lines with Indigenous people in mental health for about the last 20 years. It's really come to my attention that the relationship between Indigenous people and the justice system, including the police, has been very difficult, if not non-existent. And that's really about the experiences of personal oppression and racism that almost all Indigenous people that I've ever come into contact with in the healthcare system have expressed, which has further mitigated, has further contributed to and enforced ongoing experiences of colonial trauma. So let me explain a little bit more in detail. All Indigenous people in Canada have experienced direct or indirect colonial trauma through the systems that have created our country. The systems created through the Indian Act and all the laws and policies that came down from that act have marginalized Indigenous people to put us all in a place where we don't have the same basic human rights and value that non-Indigenous Canadians have. What this means is that when an Indigenous person walks into a healthcare setting or goes to the police or into court, they don't receive the same treatment based on their race. When this happens, that triggers experiences of trauma that happen through residential school, through the 60s scoop, and through other systemic experiences that were put onto us by the creation of Canada. When that happens, that puts Canada in a place of grave human rights violations, which have been taken to task only in the last 15 years by the United Nations. And the result of that, it was the striking of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Truth and Reconciliations Report, the UNDRIP report, and other policy documents where we see a lot of things that have been spoken about already on this panel as being very important to the system of calls to action around reconciliation, calls to action around human rights for Indigenous people, Black Canadians, and other marginalized people of color. What this really means is when we talk about defunding the police, or we talk about what's wrong with the police, it's about those actual personal narratives that contain those examples of personal harm and personal oppression that individual Native people that I've worked with clinically and in the education system, that is the end result of that. It's about understanding that what happens at the system level, that's political, that's law driven, that's about policies, becomes very personal for Indigenous people. In my experience of working with them, in my experience of doing Indigenous health research. And what that means is not just that it's unacceptable that a system such as the justice system and the police system are continuing to enforce colonial policies and procedures and laws through the act of enforcing law. But it's unacceptable that we have a system that has set that up in the first place as being part of what it means to enforce the law. Because enforcing the law in Canada means enforcing personal racism and personal oppression through a system that created an inequity for people based on race. So back to my point about what it means to alter the funding or defund the police system isn't about not understanding or respecting the need for law enforcement. Of course we need law enforcement. I don't think anyone can say that we don't, and I'm not saying that. And you know, even when I talk to, I'm the single mother of 4 children. My youngest child said to me, "What are you doing now?" I said, "Well, I'm going on a panel about defunding the police." She says, "Why would we do that? The police are nice. A lot of the police are nice." And that's because she's come into contact as a little girl. She's only come into contact with the Aboriginal peacekeeping officers who went to her Aboriginal Head Start, to police officers that I know who are Black Canadians or Indigenous Canadians who are working really hard to repair that relationship and to change that narrative. And that's the type of thinking that we need to do, is we need to change that narrative through people's experiences by altering the policy and changing the way that police is created, the way that police are funded, the way that police are based on, police services and frameworks are based on a colonial regime right now. It's the colonial regime that funds and sets the tone of policing in Canada that has to change. It's not that we don't like police or law enforcement. It's that police and law enforcement come from that colonial framework as a paradigm, and changing that framework to a framework that is based in, as Dr. Shoush talked about, reconciliation, or as Dr. Nnorom talked about in terms of human rights and not being fear-based. We need to change that narrative, and the only way we can change the narrative that exists for Indigenous people and Black Canadians that has allowed these atrocities to happen recently and since the police began, because I, as a Native person, and every other non-white person in Canada either has personally experienced violence from police or has someone close to them who has. It's a fact of life as a Native person to know that's not only a possibility, but it's a probability that that's going to happen when we come into contact with the police. Not because the police themselves are the problem, it's because of the colonial framework that underlies, funds, and has colonized the minds of all Canadians. And that's what we need to do, is we need to decolonize Canada and its systems, including the police force, in a way that's going to show reconciliation on the part of non-Indigenous Canadians to understand that Indigenous people, Black people, brown people, people who aren't from the dominant culture are actually have equal human rights to what everybody else has. So thank you.
Perfect. So I just want to come back into it just in case. So the Q&A is open. So please, if you have any questions at any time, please start talking. It will go into there and that'll be perfect for us. We have Donna coming up next, so please welcome her.
Okay, good afternoon. Thanks so much for this opportunity to speak to you. And even as I'm speaking, even as I'm talking about this, I'm still trying to come to terms with somehow we're still talking about the fact that we live in a society actually where vulnerable people. So at first, let me just introduce myself. So my name is Donna Alexander. I'm a social worker specializing in addiction and mental health. So I finished my social work training in 2002. So since 2005, I've been working as a social worker specializing in addiction and mental health. And I work for a large mental health and addiction hospital, but I also do a lot of my work in the shelter system with homeless, street involved youth. And so great part of my work has been we're repeatedly having to call access the service of Toronto Police Services, because I work with a psychiatrist at least once a week. We usually work in the community at a shelter or drop-in for homeless youth, 16 to 24. And so as I was saying before, as I'm saying this, and since yesterday I've been thinking about it, and I'm still trying to come to terms with the fact that as a society, we're here having this discussion about what is happening to our most vulnerable population. Because for people that are experiencing mental illness, that's in fact the most vulnerable point in their lives. And as a society, for us to have allowed this, and I say we, because part of it is that I work within the systems. And so when I talk about myself included with some degree of, of accountability for myself as well, because we allowed this to continue for so long and we have lost so many people that were mentally ill. And so I am still trying to come to terms with that myself. And so, so when we talk about, so the context of the work were quite repeated calls to Toronto Police Services. And since 2005 until now, repeated calls, and most of the times when the officers show up, the call, we never know what's going to happen, in that the response is often quite subjective, quite arbitrary, a lot of times very disorganized, chaotic. But one thing is for certain, is that these calls are quite traumatic. It's traumatic for us. It's traumatic for all the staff that have to witness it. It's traumatic for the families that have experienced the loss, but it also traumatizes the community. So it's a collective trauma that the community is experiencing every single time that we lose one of our patients that are mentally ill. And now we're, you know, as people that work within the system, like the other speakers before me, we talk about, but I live this, I live this on a almost day-to-day basis. And so for me, it's really real. And so I wanted to talk about it from that context, because every single time when we have to call Toronto Police Services, we never know what's going to happen. And that really impedes the work that we're trying to do. And I would suggest that a lot of times we debate whether or not to call because we don't know the outcome, and we don't want to have to look families in their faces and having to live with the guilt that somehow we played a role in the death of their loved ones. And yes, most of these youth, you know, they're street involved, but they do have families. And part of the reason why where they might be on the street is because they're so sick that part of their paranoia is directed at their families. So this is how come they end up in the street. I think, you know what, there is no question that we need to develop a new service model, because like the other speakers before me talked about, this model is not working. And I know the pushback in the past has been that, okay, crisis mobile teams, they're not 24 hours, but there's nothing that's stopping us from redesigning the system in a way that makes sense, in a way that works for people with mental illness. There is no reason why, if we know in advance that a person is mentally ill, that they end up dead at the end of the encounter. And so, you know, this is why I'm saying that, you know, as I talk about this, I am still trying, because I've seen it so many times. And it's like every single time we cannot breathe. Once we call, once we pick up, and I've made so many of these calls, and every time I pick up the phone and I call, I never know what's going to happen. And it's traumatizing. It's a repeated re-traumatization all over again. And so we're talking about, you know, police services and the way how they're not trained in de-escalation. But I think it goes beyond that, because not only are the officers not trained in de-escalation, but oftentimes the officers do the exact opposite of what we were trained to do. And it's almost as if there's a rush to get the encounter over with as soon as possible. And so simple things such as just explaining why you're there. Because a lot of times when police officers show up, if you're a client that does not have capacity, it's very triggering to see an officer in uniform. And a lot of clients, they don't have capacity. Immediately they think the officers are there to take them to jail. And so they react to such. And so this is why a lot of times just the sight of the officers is enough to escalate. And if the officers do not know how to de-escalate, then the situation becomes way out of control, really too fast. And so I want to say that training makes a big difference, right? Training makes a difference. I've called before where, and so this is the point about resources, right? If you can call and 8 officers can arrive, you know, in order to accompany the client to the hospital, however chaotic that is, then of course, when we talk about restructuring, it's not about resources in my view, because often the resources are there, because it's usually sometimes 6 to 8 officers, right? And so all we're saying is that we need a new service model that will allow for crisis workers to come, because clearly, as I said, resources is not an issue, right? And so, like I was saying before, I have been on calls before where I have called, and you know, it was so chaotic with the office. And the last thing you want to do is when a client is in crisis, is that the last thing you want to do is to point your gun at the client and start screaming. And yet over and over again, I see this happen. And I can never forget this time, the last time when this happened, when I called and then they blocked off the street and the officer like, kept advancing and the client kept backing up. And I felt responsible. So I'm trying to get over there in order to mediate things. And then out of nowhere, this petite officer, she came and she walked up to the client and she said, "Sir, we are here to take you to the hospital." And he said, "Why?" And she said, "Because the staff called and said you were not doing well." And immediately he said, "Okay." And she said, "Sir, I just needed to drop the crutches." He pushed away the crutches. She walked over, she put the cuffs on, she got him in the car, and that was it, right? Because again, she clearly knew what she was doing in de-escalation. And somehow, I don't know how she knew, but she was clearly trained, right? And so this is all we're saying, that resources need to be allocated very differently. And so what are we talking about? If we don't do this, right? How many more people do we have to lose, right? How many more vulnerable? Because like I was saying to you before, there is no more vulnerability than when you're mentally ill, right? And so how many more people do we have to lose? Is there a number? And what is that number? You know? And so other police services have successfully changed their model in order to implement a model that works, right? And so, you know, for me, it raises important fundamental questions. And Dr. Nnorom, she talked about it before. And so it raises a question on, if these were mostly white people, would this still be happening? Because for the most part, the occurrences disproportionately affect people of color, Black and other racialized groups. And so we have to ask the questions, and I'm going to be blunt and say, if this was mostly white people, would this still be happening? And I think that's important for us as a society to really think about and to answer this question, right? And if this continue, how much of this can the community, how much of this trauma can the community really handle, right? And again, as a society, how do we allow this to happen repeatedly, over and over and over again? And how are we still having this conversation when changes should have been done already?
Good evening. My name is Maurice Michelin. I'm a primary care nurse practitioner, and I'm happy to be at this event. So much of what's been said already, I'll be saying again from my perspective though. From the perspective of someone who their first nursing position was in Northern Ontario in a fly-in remote First Nations community. I worked with First Nations peoples for the first 3 years of my career, and followed by 5 years working in downtown Toronto, providing care to homeless and street-involved youth. For the last 10 years, I've been the founder and clinic director of Emery Keelsdale Nurse Practitioner-led clinic. Our interdisciplinary team here at the clinic provides care to some of the most vulnerable folks in Northwest Toronto. And I'm here this evening to recount to you some of our clinic's experiences with mental health and the police in Northwest Toronto. Prominent amongst these experiences is our story of caring for Andrew Loku. Caring and some of the other tenants in his building, and some of the work that has been done in Northwest Toronto by in the communities of San Pietro and San Antonio Way. While the numbers are quite clear that racialized peoples and racialized peoples with mental health disorders are at higher risk to be shot and killed by the police, I would like to preface my remarks by saying that I'm not here to blame the police or institutions. Rather, as has been said, I see my contribution tonight as bearing witness to what I've experienced from my perspective as a Black male healthcare provider in Toronto, and to shift the conversation from actions of individuals to those factors that determine the health outcomes of populations. And among these factors are housing, immigration status, gender, and race. So it was shortly after the Summer of the Gun that we formed the clinic, and Andrew Loku was one of my first patients. He was a tall, mild-mannered, dark-skinned man in his early 40s at the time, and he was a construction worker who had been in Canada for several years. And I will never forget the first time I met him and introduced him, hit myself to him. I remember him shaking my hand. I remember the feeling of his large kind of construction worker's hand, very softly and very gently, closing around my hand as if he was carrying an egg to crack it at breakfast. I remember his voice was so soft and so mild-mannered and so demure that at times I had to ask him to repeat himself many times in order that I could properly understand him to answer my questions. We had regular interactions over the months and years leading up to his death, and he always came across as the gentlest of people. And this is why when I heard about his death, I was so shocked and dumbfounded. For those who may not recognize that name, Mr. Loku was neither the first nor the last in a long line of Black, Indigenous, and racialized men shot by police and women shot by police over the last 30 years in Toronto. Andrew Loku was 45 when he was shot and killed by the police in July 2015. So as I was processing my own feelings around the death of Mr. Loku, I received calls from that other patients, one other patient specifically, was in acute psychiatric distress. And when this patient presented to my office, she told me that she was one of the upstairs neighbors that called 911 in response to Mr. Loku that day. And she was visibly shaken. But more than that, a mental illness that she was beginning to get under control was starting to worsen again. With the support and quick action from a team of healthcare providers from both the Canadian Mental Health Association and our clinic, we were able to keep her out of the hospital that day. However, 2 years later, she was one of many individuals asked to testify at his inquest. As that date approached, her mental health began to deteriorate again. She was reliving the trauma of Mr. Loku's death at the hands of the police. She came to my office for an urgent appointment, and she said she felt unsafe by herself at home. She was considering suicide. After an hour in the exam room, we decided together to call the mobile crisis intervention team to come and escort her to the hospital. As you've heard already tonight, this team is a team usually consisting of a nurse and a police officer who attend calls where mental health is identified as a primary concern. In my experience, the professionals who work on this team are extremely skilled in non-violent crisis intervention, but unfortunately, on the day of our call, there happened to be 2 other mental health crises happening close by. And so this specialized team was not available to us. Instead, a pair of young constables came to the clinic to bring her to the emergency room for assessment. Understandably, they need to conduct their own assessment, but I started off by attempting to provide them history and context. But unfortunately, they weren't listening. Initially, they stood over her, and while not overtly aggressive, they questioned this woman in a rapid fire and pointed style that you might suspect or expect from someone who's questioning a suspect and not someone suffering a mental health crisis. I could feel the situation was worsening. The patient was visibly distraught, and I stepped in. I asked them to step aside, and I re-explained the situation. And I'll say to you that asking police officers to stop while they're in the midst of conducting their work is not an easy or a fun thing to do for a Black man. I was actually quite nervous to do this, but I also felt like I had to do it for my patient. I emphasized the importance of a soft touch, that the goal was not to re-traumatize the patient, but to help her. I explained that she was seeking help and not running from it. After that, the police officers sat down, changed their tone, their body language, and things went much more smoothly. What I'd like to emphasize in sharing this story is how precarious the outcome could have been in this situation. So if defunding and reallocation of the police budget happened, could there be more than 1 or 2 MCIT teams available in any geographical location? would that service be better resourced? Could there be unarmed constables dedicated to nonviolent crisis intervention, trained in how to use their tone, their body language, their empathy in dealing with vulnerable individuals? A second experience I'd like to recount is one of a community intervention that our clinic helped coordinate in a TCHC building. The community of San Pietro and San Antonio Way experienced shootings every year for the previous 4 years up until this intervention. As the Toronto community housing communities go, this is a fairly small one. It had a small neighborhood of about 40 attached houses backing onto a wooded path. Patients from this neighborhood were coming to the clinic with complaints about sleep, abdominal complaints, worries about their children. And after a year of ongoing health concerns, the clinic, in conjunction with the community their community association, organized a meeting. We met one night and had a conversation about what was happening and heard about the individual mental health issues that they were experiencing. And we also heard about residents suffering from a lack of sleep, anxiety, fear, depression, and trauma. There were families that were choosing to send their young boys and girls to live with relatives or friends in other parts of the city, in fact, in other parts of the world at times, rather than have them grow up in this community. Families were being torn apart in this small community out of fear. The clinic also heard that there were tensions between the community and the local police. Instead of feeling that the local crimes were being investigated, we were told that folks often felt that they were being investigated. The community identified a common concern which had been left unaddressed for years. The residents wanted security cameras that functioned, common area lighting that worked in order to deter unwanted nighttime activity. After that evening, the clinic supported a community initiative with the TCHC to replace cameras and improve lighting and security. Since this time, in 2017, as far as I know, and I checked in last night with one of the community leaders, there has not been a single incident of gun violence at this location. Now, so if defunding and reallocation of the police budget happened, could there be special liaison units within the police or social services whose sole function was community development? In the same way that young Canadians often travel the world to build a school or to dig a well, could our police and other agencies really work to establish legitimacy in the eyes of the people that they serve and trust in the eyes of the people that they protect? So all of the stories I've just discussed happened to Black and Brown and Indigenous people in my practice. If there's anything I'd like you to take away, it's that their traumas don't end with the individuals themselves. They run through families, as in the San Pietro and San Antonio Way. They run through communities, and they run through generations. And so what happens if the police are not defunded? So what? So my concern is that we'll, as a society or as a Toronto community, be experiencing more of the same. And we become numb to the effects of trauma until the Band-Aid is ripped off again, until there's another unavoidable tragedy when the wound opens again and we remember to have this conversation again. So I always wonder if families, and this has been said in many ways by many of the presenters, but I wonder if families in Leaside or the beaches or in Woodbridge had to move their children out of their community to live with someone else, I wonder how radical a change that we would be willing to consider if that was happening. I guess the final thing I'd like to say is this. My final hopes lies in the fact that each time I witness this discussion, the discussion that kind of starts with Rodney King for me and moves on to Sami Yatim or Andrew Loku or Ijaz Chowdhury, my hope and my belief is that each time that we have this discussion, we're actually getting closer to communicating our truth. The truth of Aboriginal and Black and marginalized people all over Toronto. And it is today that I hope and I believe that this truth will resonate with our members of City Council in order to consider a more concrete change going forward. Thank you.
So we just want to start with a basic one, I think, for the day it is today, because John Tory came out with a new motion. So I just wanted to pose this to the panel. Do we agree with Mayor Tory's new motion? What do we like or we do not like? Because he came out with a bunch of stuff saying about reform, and he's moved away from the word defunding. He's moved away from what we're actually asking when we ask for the full reallocation of resources to these communities in the way that we're talking. So what do you got? Does anyone want to take that?
You know how I feel about reform. I really make it clear that reform is not a solution. Reform is not the approach. What we really need to be doing is resourcing alternative realities, right? We need to shift away from this reliance on colonial systems of anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, exclusion, punishment, all of this inefficient, deadly strategy, and shift towards something that's actually truly restorative, that builds communities, that changes outcomes for people. So reforming is a waste of money. It's a waste of more money that could have been put into communities to start with. And I really, we cannot move fast enough to start reimagining that and to shift our budget.
Definitely what Dr. Shoush is saying is extremely important, and I do agree with that. However, because of my perspective, I do think that the reforms are a good start. I think my big concern is that these reforms may not be intensive enough, or what some people might call drastic enough. I think the reform is just sort of the tip of the iceberg, and the problem with reforms is that can be a way to actually shut down the problem and not address what the actual real issues are, which are the systemic ways that the police are created, meaning what their paradigm is, how they're trained, who's inducted, what they do, what their objective is. Those are the things that need to be reformed, not only the things on the surface. And I feel like some of these reforms are very superficial, and that the reforms need to really dig deep at what is the objective of the police force? How is the police, how are we inducting people into be police? How are they being trained? What are they understanding about the positionality of different identities and peoples within Canada? How are we understanding the enforcement of continued colonial policies within the police system, whether that's around immigration, whether it's around the Indian Act, whether it's around freedom of religion, whether it's around mental health? These are all colonial policies that continue to be perpetrated on non-white people through the police system, and that's where the reform has to happen. And the danger of these superficial reforms is that we get something like a medicine wheel next to the skating rink and the pond at City Hall, and then everyone says, oh look, now the city is Indigenous friendly, or oh, we're not allowing Native costumes. I personally don't care about Native costumes and a medicine wheel put up at City Hall. I care about clean drinking water, Indigenous families for Indigenous children, access to healthcare, access to education. let's not make these superficial reforms and say, okay, we're doing something. Let's actually work with the people who are disenfranchised, disempowered, killed, harmed, and hurt to make the deep changes that need to be made. An example of that would be in concrete terms, if the mayor and the city councilors are listening, is why not invite all of us panels to sit down and strategize a new plan for how to structure the City of Toronto Police. I'm sure that we're all capable of helping them in a good way, because we work with communities and we don't just bring our voices, but we go back and talk to our people and ask them, you know, what is it that we need? And that consultation and that process has to start somewhere for them to make these reforms, and not just these superficial reforms that are about basically, you know, are basically not really much more than lip service when it comes down to what happens. I'll stop. I have a lot more to say, but I'll stop and let my colleagues who are just wonderful and amazing, and that I'm truly thrilled to be in their company, speak now. So, merci Cho.
And I'm just going to say that I have a great idea on where we could get the money to make those changes, Suzanne. That would be by getting $500 million out of the police budget to make changes in our communities.
100%. That's the easy way to start. So a question actually for Donna that just came up. So the Toronto Police has mental health units that we know that come out. Maurice talked a lot about them. Why can't they just respond to units, or why can't we just increase the number of those units? What is wrong with that idea?
So I think that's a service model that has been practiced in other places. And I think as a model that works, that's one of the service models that I was talking about. And I can't, you know, and so the question is, what is wrong with it? Absolutely nothing as a service model. And I think, like I was saying before, the pushback has been that they're not classified as first service responders. But all of these things, all of these artificial roadblocks that we've been talking about, those things can change. So all of the roadblock, all of the pushback so far, it's not that things are that these things are insurmountable. These things can all be changed, and those things work. So, you know, if we're talking about it, yes, but we would have to have them on a 24-hour basis. Can we do this? Absolutely we can. Because crisis does not only happen between 9 to 5 every day. Crisis happens 24 hours every day. And so I've often wondered, what is the point of having crisis team and only having them 9 to 5, or only having them during the daytime, when I suspect that most of the calls would be like overnight or after hours, after traditional working hours.
Okay, so we just kind of want to move on to this question that it seems like it's good for Suzanne, Dr. Shoush, if that was okay for you. So defund feels like a radical term. How do we better explain that we mean, like, what does it mean versus reallocating funds versus abolishment? Where all these terms go, and what are the differences to you?
Yeah, so language is incredibly important, right? Defunding means that we're acknowledging that there is a significant problem with the way we've structured our budgets. This is not about, oh, we just got to reallocate a few dollars here, a few dollars here. It's that we've created a situation that is fundamentally flawed. We've created a structure that is fundamentally flawed. We've created structures that are not even clear who is supposed to be protected and what is supposed to be protected and who is supposed to be served, right? We have to look at how do we actually defund and refund and rebuild, right? People find that so controversial to talk about defunding the police, and how controversial is it when we talk about defunding childcare or defunding universities? I saw a guy, an amazing young man at one of the rallies with a sign that just said, "You defunded my education to paint your police cars black." And yeah, this is the situations that we're dealing with. Using the word defunding is important because we are talking about defunding. We're talking about addressing and admitting that there has been a significant wrong made and that we have to readdress this. Yeah. It's not reform, not reallocation, not redistribution.
It's like we've tried that before. Like, how many times can we try reform?
No, reform is not effective. It has not been effective because it can't. And it's like I said, it's rooted in a relationship of violence and non-consent.
Yep.
It has to be re-envisioned into a relationship of consent, a relationship of reconciliation. As long as the fundamental basis of relationship between police and the community is one that's rooted in violence, like Donna just said, it's triggering. It's triggering to be a Black or an Indigenous person in the city and see the police. It's triggering to be in crisis. It's triggering to be unwell. It's triggering to providers. It's triggering to patients. It's a very difficult situation. The reform, like I said before, just indicates that the only thing we think is wrong is protocol, right? And protocol, this is broken beyond protocol. So this is not a reform situation.
Perfect. That is the exact idea that we're coming for as Doctors for Defunding the Police. Like, this is not acceptable. This is not going to be reformed by, like John Tory said, let's look at this time next year, today, and look how far we get. Like, that's not what we're asking for. We're saying our communities are dying today, and it's unacceptable what's going on. And reform isn't going to work unless, like, there has to be a new imagining of how things work. So that moves on to the next question. This is a good one. So can we really see change in our lifetime? Just this little optimistic question for anyone who wants to answer that.
Okay, so I think so. And I think so because, the systems does not change on their oppressive systems does not change on their own. Oppressive system change when we, the constituents, when we resist the system and we demand a change. The systems work the way they do, like all other oppressive systems, because they benefit some and they disadvantage other people. And so it's not about us passively waiting for the system to change, because at this point it seems as if there's no political will to change the system. It's how we resist the system. It's how we continue to push up against the system in order to elicit the changes that we need. So it's about how we manage ourselves, how we resist the current governance that does not support the majority of what we, the constituents, need. Yes, the systems will change. I believe the systems will change, but I believe the systems will change when we change and when we start resisting more of the systems. And part of that is that we have to believe the systems will change, because unless we believe the system change, we will not act in a manner that will elicit those changes.
That is very fair. So, Maurice, I kind of wanted to ask you a question, if that was okay. Is it safe sending social workers to a crisis call if there's a weapon present? And how do we manage that?
That's a good question. So I'll just give you a little bit of background. One of the clinic's activities has been doing home visiting for the last 10 years as well. So we've gone into many different situations that sometimes are a little bit dangerous, sometimes are uncomfortable. So I would say that having police is triggering for people. So however whatever their kind of outward expression of their policeness is, so whether that's kind of black uniforms and big belts and guns, that would be something that I would definitely want to keep out. But that said, I've also seen individuals, I've also seen techniques of violent crisis intervention that work in many different situations. So techniques of having 2 and 3 and 4 people instead of just having one. Techniques of, assessing how you kind of go into a house, whether you ask someone to come out. So there are so many different ways of assessing the situation, checking the responsiveness of the individuals, keeping yourself safe. So personally, I don't know how far, and I know kind of what the tenet is, right? That it's not to have police involved. I would be fine to have someone involved who could be a backup, but they can't look like the military. And for me, that's what it kind of comes down to. You can have people who, as Suzanne was saying, are operating from this position of, if you don't do what I say, I can always take you there. I can always make you do what I want you to do, because that's never going to engender trust and legitimacy. So that would be my answer.
Police budgets have been increasing forever, but why have we now just started talking about it? What is changing in the environment that is making us talk about this more? And what do you see for the future?
So first and foremost, this is not a new conversation. This is a new conversation in the mainstream. This is not by any stretch of the imagination something that is new. People from Black and Indigenous communities have been talking about defunding and abolishing and dealing with the colonial violence structures of police forces since the RCMP was founded. Since the RCMP was founded to literally remove non-compliant Indigenous people off their land by force, and to force our families to go to residential school, and to force all of the reforms intended to create Canada as a prosperous, thriving nation. When you look at these reforms, it's never going to be effective until we can build a society that is not so rooted in white supremacy. And even the idea of white supremacy is such a new thing to say in a mainstream conversation. So even 2-3 years ago, I would not, it was not acceptable to openly discuss white supremacy. It's not openly acceptable to discuss things like defund the police, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter. Reforms and police budgets that continually increase, all they are doing is increasing a colonial force that damages and harms Black and Indigenous people. It was designed that way. That's what I said. The system isn't broken. It was built that way. There's a reason that that's a fantastic chant that everyone likes to sing at the rallies, because it's very true. So when we're looking at the budget and we're talking about defunding the police, we're talking about using those resources to start rebuilding a new narrative, a new society, and a new culture in which we're seeing the reduction in colonial oppression. We're seeing the reduction in systemic violence. We're seeing the reduction in systemic poverty, in systemic criminalization. So we're actually able to use that $500 million to start with, to start addressing societal problems. And that will hopefully show that the more money we take away from this colonial violent force, the less we need them. The idea that we need police is very, very rooted in the idea that Black and Indigenous people need to be controlled. They need to be in a position of honestly just control, that there has to be some kind of punishment at all times. It's not rooted in restorative justice. It's not rooted in healing. There's nothing healing about a punishment. We call it correctional institutions. These are not correcting behavior. These are horrific places that should not exist. The mass incarceration of Indigenous people, Indigenous women, of Black people, of Black men and Black women is unacceptable. And the conditions in which they are incarcerated is horrific beyond belief. We've taken 2 massive national inquiries, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the UN Report on African Canadians, and every single one of those national reports expresses significant concerns. 2 of them have used the word genocide in Canada. This involves the mass incarceration of Indigenous and Black people. This is not an American problem. This is a problem that is so widespread in our own country, and it's because, again, we expect the police to use baked-in racial biases and colonial practices to control all of us. There's a reason, Semir, why you were carded 12 times when you were, 15, 16 years old? There's reasons for this. The police are expected to be able to predict that you're about to commit a crime. And how could they possibly predict that without using a baked-in racial bias, an implicit bias, a racist worldview, right? There has been so much segregation in our country as a result of the Indian Act that most people who are non-Indigenous do not even have Indigenous people as friends or as acquaintances. you know, Jesse Thistle said it amazingly in his 2017 definition of Indigenous homelessness in Canada. And he said that despite Canada's reputation for multiculturalism, it remains near impossible for most Canadians to imagine themselves as an Indigenous world, as an Indigenous kinship system, right? This is segregation. This is the apartheid of our country. So we need to start defunding as a step towards decolonizing. And I understand that you cannot decolonize the police until you decolonize our entire society. I understand that they are an inherently colonial structure. And I understand that we need the money to rebuild a new structure.
Absolutely. That's the perfect answer. So actually, I have a question that comes from the online world right now. This is actually for Dr. Stewart. You said something about, are we talking about continuing policing? Because I think what you were saying was confusing people a little bit. Or do we want to move forward with abolishment? What are we actually asking for, and what would it look like to you?
So yeah, I saw that comment in there, and the comment was, what did I mean by the fact that we need law enforcement? And I think probably the quickest and easiest way to answer that would be to reference what Dr. Shoush just said about white supremacy, as well as to look at what the dismissed comments were in the questions and answers. Because we need law enforcement to not only continue to change and meet the actual needs of the society in a good way, but we need actually law enforcement to protect us from itself, from the mainstream, from the people who aren't able to understand that Black lives matter, that Indigenous life matters, that people have equal rights regardless of their skin color, and also to address, and even though this isn't the ideal situation because the way that police actually respond in outright racist ways to Indigenous women, to Black men, to Indigenous youth and men, to all people of color, is that because colonialism has created this crabs in the bucket situation for all of us. And the reality is we still need the police in a good way to protect our women who are vulnerable to violence, to protect our men who are vulnerable to violence, to protect our children who are vulnerable to predators, because that still happens today. And we need to rebuild this relationship with law enforcement, as it's called, to change the narrative of what it is, to be based on healing, support, care, love, all of the integral principles of the Indigenous paradigm. That's what law enforcement could look like from a new place that's not built on colonial ideology of might makes right and our way or the highway, and all the terrible examples and stories and things that have happened since the police were created to enforce that colonial rule. We need the police right now because it's not a safe place out there, but we need the police to be there to protect everybody, not just the white people. I don't know if that makes sense or not. Maybe someone wants to add to that.
Yeah, there's actually a question that kind of bounces off that, and I wanted to give it to Donna and Dr. Shoush, if that was cool. Like either of you or both of you. What responsibilities do hospitals have in calling police on people in distress? And where does the limit of our responsibility go? And how far do we need to advocate for our patients when this is happening?
So that's a good question, and I'm glad that some hospitals have come out and make public statement to say that they actually support a new service models or reforming or whatever reimagining. So that's to say that. But the thing is, you know, structurally, right? So we're talking about systemic structural issue, right now. This is the way that hospitals. The way how the system is designed currently, hospitals do not have a choice, right? This is the way the system is currently structured. And so fundamentally, this is why we need to break down the system and then reconstruct the system. Because, you know, it's like, you know, if I'm at the hospitals and, you know, in the past I've been sitting in my office and there have been clients in the West End, right? Where I have called the police and, you know, and I've actually had to say to the dispatcher, my client is in distress. He has schizophrenia. He's been off his meds. So to humanize the client. And then to say to the officer, to the dispatch, please, my expectation is not that that the officers are going to go and they're going to shoot this client and they're going to kill him. But as a clinician, this is not a conversation that I should have to say, right? Assuming a system work, then this is not a caution that I would have to ever give a dispatcher because a system would be effective, right? But the system as it works, the hospitals at this point, they you know, they have to follow they have to follow the system as it works. And this is a system we have that is an imperfect system. And so this is the system we currently have, and this is a system that we have to work within the confines of. And so we reluctantly and with heavy hearts, we work within the system that we all know does not work.
Suzanne, actually, just to add more levels to it before you answer. The system doesn't work. This is clearly what we've been talking about, how we go with all our discussions. But what would the ideal model be to respond to these crises? Like, how could we actually look at this and move forward? We know there's programs that are such, like the Cahoots programs in Oregon. So there's a program that defunds the police and they have a community service that goes in and does their thing. Or in Camden, New Jersey, they had a program where they also defunded the police and reallocated the resources to other things. What do you think it would look like in Toronto?
So first and foremost, it involves the demystifying and the fact that we assume that a crisis has to occur in the first place. We have to start there. A crisis does not have to occur in the first place. We know that exposure to poverty, racism, structures of disenfranchisement and uninclusion lead to mental illness. We know that even racism itself can trigger schizophrenia. So we drive people into crisis by not properly resourcing the communities. And then we just think, how are we going to deal with this crisis? Like, what are we going to do? I don't want to call 911. Is there a different phone number? Okay, yes. Sometimes those things will be inevitable, that we have to have a number to call. But we can also focus a tremendous amount of our resources on everything that led up to the crisis in the first place. Right? That is incredibly important to make that point clear. This is not a moment of the police pulling a trigger. But that said, every single time you call the police, you have to know this phone call could result in a death. This phone call could result in the police killing this person. This $20 could result in somebody dying. Is your call really that? Is that an option for the outcome that you want? Because if it's not, you should not be calling 911. Right? If there's a homeless person that looks unconscious and I'm like, I'm going to call someone, I'm going to call 911. Am I willing to take responsibility that my phone call is going to relate in that person's death? I don't feel well. I'm going to call the police myself. If you think about it from that frame of view, the police, when you're dispatching people, so just like a little bit of a side story, I worked up north, as you guys know, for a really long time, and defunding the police goes beyond Toronto. We see horrific instances of lack of basic fundamental infrastructure in many northern and rural communities. Yet the OPP have a tremendous budget, the RCMP have a tremendous budget, right? I worked in a community for several years where the closest police outpost was an hour and 40 minutes away, okay? In this community, we had murders, suicide, domestic violence. We had everything that Toronto has. You know, you can't tell by looking at me, but I'm not a big person. I'm a small person. I'm maybe like 5'2", 100 and something pounds. I don't show up to a crisis ready for a fight because I will lose that fight, right? If you show up not ready for a fight, you will do everything possible not to fight. And I don't fight. I've never tasered someone. I've never put someone in a chokehold. I've never brought a gun with me to a house call. And I think that that is really, really relevant and really important. We have to re-envision the fact that crises didn't have to occur in the first place. And we have to re-envision the fact that there is a way to restore safety that is not punitive and that is not based in colonial views of Black and brown bodies.
That was the perfect answer for us to end off, I think. So first, thank you everyone for being here. It really means a lot to us that you would be willing to come on such short notice to be here with us. It just is a testament to how important this is and how much we care about our city and what future could actually be. So before we leave, I just want to go over our recommendations like one more time, just to hammer it home. So as Doctors for Defunding the Police, we are demanding the following. Full transparency of the Toronto Police Services budget with disclosure on how and why the police budget allocations have been prioritized over mental health, housing, education, recreational, and healthcare resources. Number two, an immediate change to the use of force laws to forbid lethal force, bodily harm, and disarming of police forces during the interactions with civilians. Number three, defunding of the police budget with reallocation towards the creation of new community emergency services to support the mental health needs of Black, Indigenous, racialized, disabled, poor, and other community members made vulnerable by structural violence, and the creation of non-police response teams trained in de-escalation and crisis support who prove their work in transformative trauma and community-informed practice. This is not reform. We are not asking for reform here. We are saying that the community needs to fully be at the table when these things happen, and we need to be able to advocate for ourselves. That is what we're asking for these things. So again, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Dr. Suzanne Shoush, Dr. Susan Stewart, Donna Alexander, Maurice Michelin, and Dr. Onye Nnorom, who had to leave a little bit early. Thank you everyone for being here. Please follow us on Twitter now for Doctors at Defunding the Police. We have our website up, and we will keep pushing to try to get this going. So thank you everyone, and I hope you have a great evening.